Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to attend today's lecture entitled International Humanitarian Law and the Crisis in Gaza, featuring internationally known human rights scholar Kenneth Roth. Before we start, I wanted to acknowledge and condemn the anti-Muslim hate crime that occurred at Rutgers yesterday. On Eid, a religious holiday that was supposed to be celebratory, quickly turned fearful for our Muslim students. When our Muslim students arrived for Eid prayer, they found the Center for Islamic Life at Rutgers University vandalized. Islamic art with Quranic scripture lied shattered on the ground, windows were broken and televisions were destroyed, and the Palestinian flag on display at the Islamic Center was stolen. The criminal's message was clear. Muslims are not safe or welcome here at Rutgers University. But I want to reiterate to all students, regardless of their identity, that they are all welcome at Rutgers University. And we thank law enforcement's support in their search for the hateful people who desecrated a religious space on our campus. Now, while we may not all agree on political analysis of matters of public importance, such as the topic of today's talk, we are all members of what President Holloway has aptly termed the beloved community. For the past month, over 1.8 billion Muslims across the world fasted by choice during the holy month of Ramadan. But for the past 6 months, 2.4 million Palestinians in Gaza have been starved and dehydrated in what the United Nations has described as a human-made famine by the Israeli government. All the while, the Biden administration and the US Congress continues to send billions of dollars of military equipment to replenish Israel's war arsenal. For this reason, it is imperative that we all learn about the war crimes committed by both Hamas and Israel, as well as the unprecedented humanitarian crisis experienced by Palestinians in Gaza and caused by the Israeli military. So this event is hosted by the Rutgers Center for Middle East Studies and the Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which I direct. As the executive director, and my name is Sahar Aziz, I am proud to direct the Center for Security, Race, and Rights as the first and only civil rights center at a U.S. law school that focuses on Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities' civil and human rights, both here in the U.S. and abroad. We do so through lecture series, policy reports, op-eds, and our newly launched Race and Rights podcast, which I encourage you all to subscribe to. And to watch our past lectures, which are all online, subscribe to our YouTube channel and also follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and at RU CSRR. Now, this work is not for the faint-hearted or the meek. For defending the civil rights of Muslim Americans and the human rights of Palestinians attracts hateful attacks by groups who peddle the very Islamophobia and anti-Arab racism that CSRR's work aims to combat. But that is what we do at the People's Electric Law School, where CSRR is housed. Rutgers Law School proudly centers the voices of those with less power and less privilege in hierarchies of subordination in a racialized American society. Our social justice mission incorporates the reality that when one speaks truth to power, the powerful lash out, defame you, and seek to censor you. But we will not be deterred from participating in what universities do best, engage in open inquiry on matters of public importance. For the best way to defend free speech and academic freedom is to exercise it regularly. So in that spirit, it is my distinct honor to host Kenneth Roth, who is the Charles and Mary Robertson Visiting Professor at the Princeton School for Public and International Affairs. Until August 2022, he served for nearly 3 decades as the Executive Director of Human Rights Watch, one of the world's leading international human rights organizations, which operates in more than 100 countries. Before that, Mr. Roth was a federal prosecutor in New York and for the Iran-Contra investigation in Washington, D.C. A graduate of Yale Law School and Brown University, Mr. Roth has conducted numerous human rights investigative and advocacy missions around the world, meeting with dozens of heads of state and countless ministers. He is quoted widely in the media and has written hundreds of articles on a wide range of human rights issues. devoting special attention to the world's most dire situations, the conduct of war, the foreign policies of the major powers, the work of the United Nations, and the global contest between autocracy and democracy. Mr. Roth is currently writing a book, Righting Wrongs, to be published by Knopf, about the strategies used by Human Rights Watch to defend human rights, drawing on his years of experience, which I cannot wait to read. So please join me in welcoming Kenneth Roth to Rutgers University.
Thanks very much, Sahar. It's my pleasure to be here. It's good to see you all and the many more online. What I thought I would do today, as the title of this talk suggests, is I want to address the conflict that is today centered in Gaza, not from a perspective that's pro-Israeli or pro-Palestinian, but rather pro-civilian. And by that I mean, I want to look at the conflict through the lens primarily of international humanitarian law. And that law is actually, contained in several thick volumes, but it's not that complicated. And what I'm going to do is to go through sort of the essence of that law and begin to apply it from what we know to the conflict in Israel, in Gaza. And I want to stress that, this law is not something that human rights groups made up. This is law that was written by the world's leading militaries to guide themselves. So this is not, pie in the sky aspirational standards. These are the standards that the leading militaries thought was the best way to fight a war. And indeed, these standards, are legally and explicitly subscribed to by Israel and by every government that is arming Israel. So these are not radical standards. These are very mainstream standards. And I think it's important to keep that in mind as we seek to apply them. Now, let me, begin this analysis with October 7th. And, many people put forth justifications for October 7th. I want to distinguish between, on the one hand, the idea of, Palestinians attacking Israeli soldiers, which is one thing, and what actually happened on October 7th, which is deliberately targeting Israeli civilians, for death, for sexual assault, for abduction. These are 100% clear war crimes. There's no justification for them. And indeed, let me, if I could, address some of the purported justifications just to show how weak they are. One offered is, Israel commits war crimes all the time, so what's wrong if Hamas doesn't? But humanitarian law is actually explicit that that's not an excuse. The obligations of humanitarian law are absolute on each side to a conflict. They are not reciprocal. They do not require comparable conduct by the other side. They're an absolute unconditional responsibility of each warring party. So Israeli conduct is irrelevant to what Hamas did on October 7th. Others say, well, but this was a fight of national liberation. This was a response to the apartheid that Israel's imposed on the Palestinian territories. Again, utterly irrelevant to the means that were used. Those may justify resorting to armed force, if that's what Hamas or Palestinian forces decide to do. It does not justify killing or abducting civilians. Those are war crimes. And it's important to make that clear because if you start allowing excuses for the justness of your cause or for the conduct of your adversary, you start excusing Israelis' conduct. So we have to be very clear about October 7th, because if we're not, we end up weakening the standards that we are trying to uphold as Israel then attacks Gaza. So let me just start with that. Now, how do we assess Israel's conduct since October 7th? And here I'm going to focus on a series of very basic principles. One is that you are not allowed to target civilians or civilian structures. You can only shoot at combatants or at military targets. That's the essence of humanitarian law. Second, you cannot fire indiscriminately into an area. So even if there are combatants or military targets in a zone, you can't treat the entire zone as a target, especially if there's civilians there. You've got to focus and target yourself on the legitimate military targets. Even if you are attacking a military target, that's not the end of the story. You have to say, is the anticipated concrete and direct military advantage of this attack justified in terms of the anticipated civilian harm? It's an assessment of proportionality. So those are, the three key principles one has to keep in mind. You don't target civilians, you only target military targets, you don't fire indiscriminately, you don't shoot when the harm to civilians is going to be disproportionate. I'll get into in a moment, also the need to allow humanitarian aid to a population in need. But these are, simple propositions that are contained in these voluminous standards of humanitarian law. Now, with respect to, targeting civilians, Israel loves to actually talk about that. They say, look at, Hamas targeted civilians on October 7th. We don't do that. But when you start scratching the surface a little bit, there are things that Israel does that are not far from that. And so let me run through a few of those. And I'm going to put the caveat into this by saying that we're still in the midst of the war. Access to Gaza has been extremely limited. Our ability to do in-depth investigations on the ground is currently curtailed. So what I'm going to be talking about are things that you can, derive with reasonable certainty from the reporting that has been done on the ground. But we have to maintain that caveat because, as it becomes possible to do more in-depth investigations, our assessments, will deepen and perhaps shift. Now, the one thing that Israel has done, it is repeatedly attacked civilian structures. Now, it usually makes sure that they're empty, but attacking civilian structures violates this basic responsibility that you only shoot at military targets, not at civilian targets. And so, one thing they've been doing is blowing up Palestinian universities. And, the only real justification that I've seen for that is, oh, these are training Hamas intelligence operatives. Now, think about that. How many people do you think have graduated from Rutgers and gone on to serve in the CIA? Maybe not a gazillion, but some. Does that make our campus here a legitimate military target? Absolutely not. But that's the logic behind Israel in a very controlled setting. I mean, they filmed this, blowing up these universities. They've done effectively the same thing with huge apartment towers, deliberately going after what are, in essence, kind of the prestige addresses in Gaza. So you'll have, a 15-story apartment building, home to perhaps 100 families. Again, they'll evacuate the building, and then they'll just blow it up. The argument is, oh, there was a Hamas office somewhere in there, or maybe a Hamas soldier lives someplace. No justification whatsoever. This is clearly just an effort to punish the civilian population and to destroy, some of the important symbols of civilian life in Gaza. And we've seen, variations on the same. Israel has been creating a buffer zone along the border between Gaza and Israel. And, you can understand why they want a buffer zone after October 7th, but they're doing it in the same way they did in the West Bank when they built the separation barrier, not on the Green Line, that is to say, not on the 67 borders, not within Israel's territory, but within Palestinian territory. And so when you look at the West Bank, the barrier goes way into the West Bank, just carving out huge swaths of land that basically become Israel. In Gaza, they are, basically taking, a kilometer-wide area, a strip of land that is very little land, and destroying everything in that area as part of this, buffer zone. We also are seeing situations where people seem to be targeted. There are these accounts of these no-go zones where anybody who enters that zone is shot, with no real indication that there are clear warnings that people have any idea what might happen to them if they venture into an area. And of course, no assertion that the people entering that area are posing a military threat. They're just shot. And there have been repeated accounts of civilians who have ended up in this situation. Perhaps the best insight we have into how the Israeli rules of engagement are playing out is if you look at the recent killing of the 7 workers with World Central Kitchen. Now, there's been a lot of debate about, did Israel know whether these were food delivery workers or not? And I'm not going to go there because my point doesn't really require an assessment of that. but rather let's take Israel at its word. Let's say, as they've described, that some soldier thought that they saw someone with a rifle jump on one of the three vehicles in that convoy. Now, that's all they've said for justification. No indication that that was a Hamas combatant versus a security guard for the convoy. No justification of why one armed person on one vehicle requires systematically killing everybody in three vehicles that were quite spaced out. This is a real deliberate effort. And what this shows is the rules of engagement and how they violate the basic responsibility under humanitarian law that you don't shoot before you know that the person you're firing at is a combatant. That there is a presumption that people are civilians until you can prove otherwise. And the proof otherwise, in this case, was, a shadowy glimpse of maybe somebody who was supposed to be a Hamas militant jumping on one of the three vehicles. In other words, basically nothing to overcome this presumption of civilian status. And, we happen to pay attention to this because 6 of the 7 killed were internationals. But think of what this means. If those are the rules of engagement, if that's the low level required before lethal force is used, what Palestinian civilians are living through and why we have 33,000 dead, roughly 2/3 of whom are civilians. So that indicates that even, this fundamental standard of humanitarian law that you don't fire at civilians is being honored in the breach by Israel, not just by Hamas. Now, a second basic rule, and I won't dwell on this long, is the rule not to fire indiscriminately into an area that has civilians in it, even if there are military targets within that area. And, even Joe Biden twice has talked about the indiscriminate bombing of Israel. Gregory Meeks, the ranking member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, is now holding up the sale of F-15 fighter jets to Israel because of the indiscriminate bombardment. And what leads them to conclude that? You just look at Gaza. There have been, numerous satellite imagery surveys done that find, basically half of Gaza is damaged or destroyed. You see whole swaths of urban areas that have been reduced to rubble. And it is hard to see how this is the kind of targeted effort that humanitarian law requires. Now, what I want to dwell on a bit more is this duty not to engage in attack that will have a disproportionate effect on civilians. And I want to look at 2 examples of Israeli attacks in particular. One is the effort that I think we have to assume is to go after the Hamas tunnels. And, obviously the tunnels are a serious military problem for Israel. They are a legitimate target in themselves. The question is the means. And what Israel has been doing, rather than more targeted efforts, rather than focusing on entrances, rather than sending troops in, they have been dropping 2,000-pound bombs over and over and over. And these are huge bombs, among the biggest in any military arsenal. And to give you a sense of this, the US government these days will not use a 2,000-pound bomb in an urban area. It will not use a 1,000-pound bomb in an urban area. It is extremely reluctant to use a 500-pound bomb in an urban area. But Israel's been using them over and over and over, even though the entirely predictable consequence is devastation in an entire community. And again, this is not an effort to go after a military target with the smallest civilian consequence. This is an effort going after the military with, at best, indifference to civilian consequences, if at worst, a deliberate effort to maximize civilian consequences. And this is not just a handful of bombs here or there. The New York Times did a very interesting kind of plotting of where these are landing. And it is, it's extensive. It's a big part of why we see such vast destruction. Now, the other example I want to focus on is the hospitals. And you may recall that, there was this claim that Al-Shifa Hospital, the principal hospital in Gaza, was over a big Hamas command center. And Israel went in for the first time, took over Al-Shifa. And what did they show for this command center? A few rifles and one tunnel, which a senior Israeli official said, yeah, we probably built back when we occupied Gaza. Now, there was a second effort to go into Shifa, and indeed at that stage, it seems like Hamas did regroup in Shifa. But there has been very little evidence that as Israel has gone from one hospital to the next, that there's been any active Hamas presence there. And hospitals are, again, presumptively protected unless there is an active military threat emanating from them. But Israel has gone in, and in the midst of a war, at a moment when people's need for healthcare is enormous, they've taken it away. They've weaponized healthcare to the point that today, only a third of Gaza's 36 hospitals are even functioning. And most of them are functioning minimally, lacking basic things like anesthesia, like intensive care units, oxygen. So this is, just leaving people to a pre-modern fate. You get injured, you hope for the best. But, the idea of having surgery, early surgery with anesthesia, the idea of having antibiotics, the idea of, recovering is incredibly remote. And then there are people who are not injured by the war, but just who have day-to-day care. People who need dialysis, people who are on cancer treatment, women who want to give birth. What do you do? And so this again, shows an enormous civilian cost with often little, if any, demonstrated military advantage. Now, let me take a moment and focus on a separate duty under international humanitarian law, and that is the duty to allow access to humanitarian aid, particularly food, to a needy population. And there's no question that the Palestinian civilian population in Gaza is in need. Israel has been, basically allowing in drips and drabs of aid, enough to avoid mass death, but not enough to avoid mass starvation. And imminent, or if you believe Samantha Power, actual famine in northern Gaza. And what this, adds up to is, a deliberate starvation strategy that is, you can debate what the rationale is. Some of it's just a way to try to put pressure on Hamas during the negotiations, even though this is using war crimes to negotiate, which is clearly wrong. Some of it may be an effort to just collectively punish the Palestinian civilian population. This is, reminiscent of President Herzog's view that there are no uninvolved civilians. Part of it may simply be an effort to make Gaza unlivable, to try to pursue the stated strategy of some of the far-right ministers in Netanyahu's government, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, where they see October 7th as a great opportunity to wipe 2 million Palestinians off the demographic balance sheet by pushing them into Egypt. So it's, it's not clear what the motive is, but what we've seen is, this use of obstruction through the inspections process, extremely understaffed, slow inspections. It can take 3 weeks to get a truck through. The inspectors are rejecting innocuous items on the argument that they're dual use. The Washington Post today has a list. It's worth looking at the absurd things that are on this list that have been rejected. And when you get rejected, you go to the end of the line, and you got to empty the stuff out and wait potentially another 3 weeks. So this is the kind of obstructionism that Israel's been using. Biden, had this conversation with Netanyahu a week ago, where he said, if you guys don't stop this, you may be losing U.S. support. And that led to, one, a promise that is completely unfulfilled to open up a crossing into northern Gaza. They're just slow walking that. But second, suddenly Israel claims that they're allowing, 400 and 450 trucks a day into Gaza. The pre-October 7th number was 500. But, if it is 400 plus, that's a lot. The UN is disputing that because it includes a lot of half-filled trucks because so much stuff has been taken out by the inspectors. But it also shows what Israel could have done if they wanted to from the start. And why were they letting in, an average of 100 trucks a day when they suddenly can allow in 400 a day? Just because that's what they decided to do to pursue their starvation strategy. So this is, again, a war crime. This is the one war crime that Karim Khan, the International Criminal Court prosecutor, has spoken out about. He said, kind of repeating the language of the UN Security Council, if you, Israel, don't allow food in at scale, don't be surprised if my office acts. Don't be surprised if you're charged with war crimes. Nice statement. It hasn't turned into anything yet. But this is, again, a strategy aimed at Palestinian civilians, and it is blatantly wrong. So these are, some of the things that Israel has been doing in violation of humanitarian law. Let me, address some of the Israeli defenses. And, some we don't really have to linger on. I mean, they say, oh, Hamas, they're genocidal, they attacked us, we're just defending ourselves, all utterly irrelevant to how you fight the war. Those have to do with whether you're justified in going to war. They have nothing to do with targeting, indiscriminately bombing, disproportionately attacking, or starving civilians. So this is just, PR change the subject. This is not a justification. Now, what Israel says when they get a little bit more serious is we're giving warnings. And they are, as they actually are required to do if at all feasible. So they were, it has been different from prior wars. In prior wars, they tended to say, your building is about to be bombed, everybody evacuate. This time they've been saying, your city is about to be bombed, evacuate. And people say, okay, where? And the answer has been go south, go south. There have been many instances of people killed en route to the south. There have been many instances of people killed when they get to the south. And of course, what's in the south? There's been no preparation to receive what today are, basically 1.5 million Palestinians living in the relatively tiny city of Rafah, who are closer to the two open border crossings, but are still, receiving utterly inadequate humanitarian care. They're in less dire shape than their compatriots in the north, but they're not in good shape. So this is a humanitarian gesture of giving warning being carried out in an utterly inhumane way. Now, the other thing that Israel talks about, and they harp on this quite a bit, is human shields. Hamas is using civilians as human shields. Hamas is fighting from civilian populated areas. Both true. Okay, those are war crimes in themselves. Human shields are always operating in a civilian area, sometimes depending on circumstances, but let's posit for these purposes that Hamas is committing war crimes in the way they're fighting. We shouldn't be surprised. That's what they did on October 7th too. That's not the end of the story. Because even if, let's assume worst case, Hamas is using human shields, the attacker still has a duty to engage in the proportionality analysis, to ask, is the advantage of targeting this, Hamas fighter, this Hamas facility, this rocket, whatever it is, worth killing all these civilians? And that's a legally strict test, which, for the reasons I mentioned, Israel seems to be ignoring quite regularly. So that's that's as far as you get really with the Israeli defenses. Now, let me just say a word before I close up about genocide. And the genocide analysis is a little complicated, so I want to just kind of go through it in a bit of detail with you. And there are in essence two parts to what genocide is as defined by the Convention Against Genocide. One having to do with acts, the second having to do with intent. And you've got to have both before you have genocide. So the acts, there are a list of several of them, but I'm just going to focus on two. One is killing people, obviously. The other is creating conditions that are unsuitable for life. And there's no question that Israel's doing both of those. When you look at, are the quantities of victims large enough to justify the act element of genocide? And the best, analogy we have is the one case where people really have been convicted for genocide. And that is the case of Srebrenica. You may remember the Muslim town in Bosnia, which various Bosnian Serbs, including the political and military leaders, were convicted of by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And there, 8,000 young men and boys were walked off and killed. And so, that's 8,000. We have, as I mentioned, let's say 20,000 civilian victims in Gaza. So the numbers are probably large enough. There's no absolute number in the convention. It says, to destroy a group in whole or in part. This is a large enough part. So the issue is really going to come down to intent, as it always does in questions of genocide. And the question on intent is, were these acts, was this killing, was this creation of devastating living conditions done with the intent to destroy in whole or in part a racial, religious, ethnic, or national group? And you may remember the argument in the South Africa versus Israel case before the International Court of Justice, where the South Africans presented a number of statements by senior military officials. There was Herzog's no uninvolved civilians that I already mentioned. There was Defense Minister Gallant's statement that these are human animals. He's tried to say, oh, I was just referring to Hamas, but if you look at it, he said that in the context of discussing the siege, which of course applies to everybody. So, it's a fair interpretation that he was saying this for everybody in Gaza. For me, one of the most chilling parts of the South African argument was this short video they showed of a bunch of Israeli soldiers singing and dancing. There are no uninvolved civilians. Just kind of repeating Herzog's words, showing, we got the message. And of course, you get these videos of people, soldiers celebrating their destruction of a village or their, desecrating of a house. So clearly this kind of language has gotten through. Israel's saying, oh, but, we have lots of, generals who are saying the opposite. They're saying we're strictly abiding by humanitarian law. These were just, senior officials who were kind of mouthing off, even if they are the top officials in the chain of command. The court ended up not relying on Netanyahu's reference to Amalek, which also many people have cited, because Amalek is a biblical story where God was supposed to have said, destroy every man, woman, child, and animal. But the Israelis also use this to just refer to their enemies in general. So the court decided not to rely on it. But in the end, I think when there is a determination of intent, they're going to also, beyond these statements, they're going to look at the conduct on the ground and work backwards. How do we make sense of this indiscriminate bombardment? How do we make sense of this, deliberate destruction of so much of Gaza? How do you make sense of the deliberate starvation strategy, if not through a genocidal intent? And so, clearly the court, if it wanted to, could find genocidal intent. It already found that there's a plausible case of genocide to be made, but that's a low standard. When it comes to the standard on the merits, it could find this way. But I want to introduce a word of caution here, because the most apt case so far is the case of Croatia versus Serbia, where the court seemed to say that on the question of intent, it's not enough for the intent to be one of several. It has to be the sole intent. And, expert analysts have looked at this and said, this is really the court's effort to kind of keep these cases away. They don't want to be flooded by these. They're not a trial court. They're a bunch of judges who hear oral argument. They're not well placed to make complicated factual determinations. They don't really want these cases. So they've kind of read out in part from the definition of genocide. And, they're kind of pursuing genocide as if it's only the final solution. And many people actually think of genocide that way. They think of the Holocaust. They think of, after a certain point, the Nazis got their hands on every Jew they could and killed them. But there is, if you think about the in part, there's also the concept of genocide as a means to an end. And in a sense, that's what also at a preliminary stage the court found with respect to Gambia's case against Myanmar over the Rohingya, where the Myanmar army killed, call it, 20, 30,000 Rohingya, not to eradicate everybody. They were perfectly happy for people to flee. Their point was to chase 730,000 Rohingya into Bangladesh. It was genocide as a means, not as an end. And that's one way to understand what Israel's doing if you pursue a kind of the Smotrich Ben Giver point of view. The court in the Croatia case suggested that it wouldn't find that genocide, that a means to an end, one where there are multiple intents, won't be sufficient. It has to be the sole intent. And nobody's claiming that Israel's pursuing the final solution in Gaza. So that's where we are. I think you, in other words, can make a case of genocide, but if you're going to be predictive about how the court's going to rule when it ultimately rules, and this is not a quick process, it may not find genocide. So the final thing I want to get into, and I'll just do this quickly because I want to have time for questions. How is the world reacting to this? And obviously the International Court of Justice precautionary measures, the kind of preliminary injunction that it issued, is binding. Israel was bound to follow these rules designed to reduce civilian casualties and to stop the starvation strategy. The UN Security Council, with Biden's acquiescence, insisted on a Ramadan ceasefire that was ignored. These are, binding rules that Israel's just been indifferent to. So what do you do there? And there are two answers that really both come back to Joe Biden. One is the Security Council could take enforcement steps. It can impose sanctions, but that would require getting past the US veto, and Biden has shown no inclination to allow that. The non-vetoes he's exercised so far have been, one in this ceasefire thing where he immediately said it was not binding. He kind of said, ignore what I just did. The other was this move to allow consideration of Palestinian statehood, which goes nowhere until it comes back to the Security Council, where Biden will veto it. So it's, so far there's been nothing on the Security Council side of an enforcement nature. But the real leverage here is the arms sales. The $3.4 billion or $3.8 billion in annual military aid, and the massive arms sales that are going almost every week to Israel. And, Biden has been, for him, quite eloquent in denouncing the killing, denouncing the starvation, but he's drawn the line and won't impose consequences. So Netanyahu's kind of gotten the idea and says, well, talk, but, I'm going to ignore you because there's nothing that comes from this. You're not going to cut the arms. And, finally, just a week ago during this private conversation, we don't know the details. Even there, apparently there was no explicit linkage, but he did say, future US support will depend on Israel acting differently. At which point Netanyahu said, we're going to open up a new border crossing in the north, even though they haven't done anything yet. But, there clearly is enormous leverage there. Biden just is not willing, for various reasons, some personal, some political, to take that step. And, similarly, Germany, similarly, the UK. And so as long as people keep, meeting their occasional protests with the completely contradictory act of arming the military that is committing those war crimes, that is committing those acts being protested, the protest will be ignored. And the obvious way to make a difference here is to impose, a real suspension of aid and arms sales, real conditionality, and Israel will be forced to listen. So I'll stop there and would welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you for joining us today for the distinguished lecture by our distinguished guest, Kenneth Roth, on international humanitarian law and the crisis in Gaza. This is our final lecture for the academic year of 2023 to 2024. All of our lectures are on our YouTube channel. We are a fully transparent organization, and we welcome people watching and listening and learning from all of our programming. And it would be remiss for me not to mention that the very work that we did today in providing expert opinion about a contemporary topic in this case about the Palestine-Israel context, has earned us the ire of many organizations and special interest groups and politicians that, in my view, are anti-Palestinian and anti-Muslim because they seek to censor and to shut down and to marginalize at best the only civil rights center at an American law school whose mission is to advance the civil and human rights of Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. But in the spirit of being at a U.S. law school that is tasked with teaching and upholding the U.S. Constitution, including the First Amendment, we are proud to continue our work, and we will allow members of the public to decide for themselves whether they would like to watch or not watch, or learn, listen, and read or not the work product that we produce. And so if you benefit from what we produce, if you find it informative, enlightening, intellectually stimulating, and you'd like to provide us with support for that, please make a donation at the Center for Security, Race, and Rights website, csrr.rutgers.edu, and press the donate button, and please give generously. And also please follow us on social media at RUCSRR and at Rutgers CSRR on Instagram. So with that, I want to thank everyone in the virtual audience for attending, and I look forward to you joining us again in the fall of 2024 as we launch our next annual lecture series. Thank you very much.